It's not about the bad things happening randomly or anything like that. Like the downfall, and we said this earlier, but it needs to feel inevitable yet preventable.
Yeah.
And I think that preventable is the key thing, that at any time the reader feels like, yeah, but we could, I love what you said about writing two versions of it, one where it
Mm,
actually does work out and becomes that, classic hero's journey tale,
mm,
and then just subverting that, just going
yeah.
the different way. Because if you do that, again, I feel like it's going to have that preventable feel. Like,
Mm.
yeah, but it didn't have to turn out like this. Releasing your inner dragon.
So, Drake, I heard a rumor that you are writing a tragedy. Is that true?
I mean, I think I write tragedy in almost everything that I write because I'm just that type of person. But yes, yes, I am. I pulled the trigger on rewriting Hamlet, Maxwell Alexander Drake's Hamlet, one of my
Okay.
favorite tragedies of all times.
I think that it is worth talking about how you pull off a tragedy. And I don't mean just like a tragic storyline or a minor tragedy. I mean an actual full blown. The story ends in disaster. The story is in and of itself a tragedy.
Yeah,
And how you pull that off while still leaving the reader feeling satisfied, because that's the trick, right? So you've got to get your message across, and you've got to leave the reader satisfied,
yeah,
that this outcome was, in fact, you know, the good for them, a good culmination of the story.
yeah, yeah. I
So,
mean, oh,
yeah,
I was gonna say, the reality is, so many people think tragedies are about making your character suffer or something like that, but most people do not connect to that. So for me, a good tragedy is about creating an emotional journey for the reader. They need to feel invested in that journey, and not just like watching it from the outside. They actually have to feel like there's some personal stake in it for them as well. It
mm,
must leave an actual impact on the reader. It must make them think about the choices that were made, the morality that happened during it, or the human nature of things. It can't just be um crap happens.
yeah,
Like, it's just not that's not a lasting story. I mean, I think one of the reasons why stories like Hamlet have lasted for hundreds and hundreds of years is because they do have that lasting impact. They do have that thing that stays with you long after the story is over. And so I think that's the big mistake that writers make when they're trying to actually write a tragedy.
yeah. Your character suffering is not the tragedy. Your character failing is the tragedy.
Yeah.
Suffering happens to everyone.
I'm not even sure if it's just the character failing that's the tragedy. I actually think it's more like a balance between inevitability and choice. It's that.
So let's talk about Hamlet. All
Okay.
right. So Hamlet, Hamlet's father dies, and Hamlet goes home, and now his uncle has usurped his throne, and he faces a number of choices.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he could have sucked it up, right? He could have sucked it up. He could have gone, well, I don't know for sure that my uncle killed my father, and I can't prove it. And things like this do happen in royal lines. And I'm just going to make sure that I'm the next king and slowly plot my revenge over the next 10 years until I have the strength to claim my throne. He could have done that.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I'm exploring in my version of Hamlet,
Mm,
which was there, but it wasn't explored because he couldn't,
mm,
because of the medium that he wrote in. He wrote in, he's limited to
mm.
the stage, is Prince Fornobras. Prince Fornobras is actually the foil of Hamlet. It's just that we don't ever get to see his story really. But technically they're the same story. Fornobras's father is killed by Hamlet's father, and he plots his revenge. The difference is that one of them chooses to methodically and logically come up with a plan to then carry out and get his revenge. And the other one allows his emotions and his uncertainty, and he's just chaotic, and he's just like, I'm gonna just be crazy. And he kills everybody. He kills himself, he kills his family, he kills everybody.
I mean, in the end, he could have run away with Ophelia and gone
Mm-hmm.
to live happily in England, where he'd come
Yep.
from. Um, and that was also an option. His
Mm-hmm.
life would have been saved, her life would have been saved, you know. He could have, there was a moment where his uncle was at prayers and Hamlet had the opportunity to strike, but instead he's like, oh no, I can't kill him while he's praying because then he might go to heaven. Like, dude, who cares?
Yeah.
You want him dead, there's his back.
Yeah.
We're done. But no.
Yeah.
And that's to me is the fall of Hamlet is
Mm-hmm.
he made choices that resulted in him failing. He didn't just fail because the world sucks.
Right.
He
There's a
failed
constant.
because he chose time after time, choice after choice to go in this path that inevitably led to everybody's dying.
Yeah. Yeah. The thing that and one of my notes in here for creating a really good tragedy is make sure that there's a sense of inevitability. Um, and that's very important. Like that tension between choice and consequence. And this is
Mm,
exactly what you're talking about here with Hamlet. We care about him through the story. We actually relate to him or relate to his loss and kind of what he's going through. But there's always that tension between, you know, but if you choose this, then inevitably that could lead to this. And so the events feel more like dominoes tipping over. They feel more like, yeah, but if you just didn't tip that domino. And so that's where that tension comes from. I think that a good tragedy really needs is that. Um, because I do believe that readers should sympathize with the characters, even as they make those mistakes. You know, we all have strengths and flaws and weaknesses and everything like that. That's why one of the flaws or one of the pitfalls that I see writers making is they're just doing it for self-destructive reasons. And
mm,
while there is an argument to be made with Hamlet that you're like, well, he's just doing that for self, he's not. He's legitimately trying. He doesn't try to kill himself. He's not trying to kill his mom. He's legitimately trying, if the whole play thing was to get his brother to be so guilt stricken that he would be
mm.
forced to admit his crimes to the world or maybe even take his own life. Like there's
Yeah.
purpose in what he's doing. So he's not just self-destruct, on some
Mm,
self-destructive mission. But again, every one of his choices are emotionally driven, and they're choices that he's making on the fly. Like he's deciding to do this right now, as opposed to, and that's why I said in my version, I'm actually writing, Fornobras is an entire story arc. We get to see
mm,
Fornobras go back to Norway. We get to see,
mm,
him and his uncle and their interaction. The fact that his uncle forbids him from going to Denmark, and he, uses that to raise the army to go to Poland.
mm.
And then circumvents that to come into Denmark anyway. So I really want to lean on that foil aspect of what Fornabros is and give that entire story that isn't given in Hamlet, even though the pieces are there, like the elements are there if you look for them. And obviously he shows up at the end. But I really want to lean into the dichotomy between those two princes and kind of how
Yeah.
they went about things differently. And at the end, Fornabros gets what he wants. He gets revenge. He gets revenge on the family. And not only that, oh, by the way, I'm also now king of Denmark, I guess.
Yeah.
Because that's the way things work. I have an army here. Your royal line is dead. It's mine.
Yeah.
So, and then Hamlet kills everyone he loves and everyone he hates and everyone, the whole nine
Everyone's just
yards.
dead. Yeah.
So that's one of the things that I'm really excited to explore in my version of Hamlet. That
So I think like there are for me, I think one of the key starting points, and we've touched on it now with creating a tragedy, is you must create a compelling protagonist. It
mhm,
must be a protagonist that the reader can relate to in some way. If it's just somebody they hate and he comes to a tragic end, that's not a tragedy. You know what I mean? Like
yeah,
you want the reader to root for this guy to make the right choices and to say, no, no, don't do that. And then he keeps going on the stupid route and he ends up in tragedy. And the reader's like, no, why did you
yeah,
do that, you idiot?
yeah.
But so you need that compelling
Because if you don't care
protagonist.
about the character, you don't care that they fail.
Yes.
So yeah.
And I think that it must be a character with agency,
Hmm.
right?
Oh
It
yes,
is
100%.
not a tragedy if you have a child that has no control over their life and you just put them into a situation where they have no agency and terrible things happen to them. That might be a tragedy on a larger scale, but for that person in that situation, they have no agency
Right.
over what happens to them. And therefore, they're just enduring suffering,
Yes.
which is a
And
different thing.
that's a mistake that I think so many people make when they're writing a tragedy that they wrap around fate. But
Yes.
fate, they are fated for this tragic event. They can't not do it.
Yeah.
The protagonist still needs to make choices, or at least have the illusion that they're making choices,
Yeah.
because and those choices need to lead to their downfall. Now, whether the argument can be made of, well, they really couldn't make any other choice than that, okay, great, we can have those arguments, but it
Mhm.
has to still feel like they have the
It has to
agency
feel like
in their
they're
life.
an active agent in this. The thing about the child suffering, I just want to stop there for a second, because you can write a tragedy about that,
Mm-hmm.
but then you're not writing about that child's downfall. You're
Right.
writing about the larger scale tragedy of a society that allows such suffering, or an individual who causes such suffering, or something like that,
Yeah.
which is a very different thing and requires a different approach. Like, yeah.
Yes.
But the kind of tragedy we're talking about here, you don't just want a protagonist who's just suffering. You want a
Right.
protagonist who has agency
Yes.
that causes them to fall and therefore suffer.
Yeah. And I've got a few other notes on the protagonists.
Mm.
Um, they can't just have flaws; they have to have
Yes.
strengths as well. They have to have things that they do correctly.
So for me, you must draw them up as though they are a normal character.
Mm-hmm.
All characters have strengths. So you give them strengths, you give them flaws. But then for me, I would, if I'm doing a tragedy, I would do two arcs. One is the what we'd all normally write. He overcomes his flaws, makes the right choice. What is the ideal outcome?
Mm-hmm.
And then go, okay, now I make wrong choices. Where do I
Mm-hmm.
make the wrong choices? And don't make them all wrong choices.
No.
Make some of them right choices, but
Yes.
some of them are wrong choices. And those wrong choices, instead of going up and overcoming his flaws, his strengths don't save him and he falls down
Right.
into his flaws.
Yeah. If your protagonist has no redeeming qualities, then it won't be painful to watch their downfall.
Yeah.
Again, they need to have those things. I mean, Hamlet isn't just this piece of garbage that's trying to murder his family and
Mm,
whine. He's not some whiny little 3-year-old. It's like, you killed my father. Even like, and this is where it turns out good. But in The Princess Bride, since I just said that, it brought
mm,
that up. Like, you know, Inigo isn't. He is still, has those redeeming qualities, even though he's the whole movie, he's like, you killed my father, prepare to die.
mm,
You killed my father, prepare to die. He's kind of got this single
mm.
vision in mind. He is still making choices that lead him down the path to try and find the six-fingered man.
Yeah.
So now that's not a tragedy, obviously. I mean, unless you're Count Rogan. But if you're the good guys, then it's not a tragedy.
Everything is a tragedy from somebody's perspective.
That is true. That is true. So yeah, they have to have redeeming qualities. They can't just be self-destructive. They have to have strength and weaknesses and all of that. But here's another mistake that I think a lot of people make. The fatal flaws need to feel natural. They need to be
Mm,
believable. So it depends on what it is. It could be arrogance or loyalty or stubbornness or misplaced trust or whatever. But it needs, like with Hamlet, we believe that you lost your father, and then you talked to the ghost of your father who said, my brother murdered me. So now in my version, that's actually chapter 5, even though it's the opening scene of the play. I actually back the story up a lot because you actually get to meet King Hamlet when he's alive and all this other stuff. But you
it's not the
need
opening. Isn't the opening scene those two bullshit guys from England who really don't need to be in the story at all? It doesn't matter. It's been a long time since I watched it.
no, the opening is when he's called to the battlements to talk to the ghost of King Hamlet.
No, the opening is those two. Anyway, it doesn't matter.
Well, at least the first major scene. I could be wrong on that
Yeah,
exactly, but
yeah. I remember this ridiculous. There's two guys that are traveling with Hamlet from England. They never appear in the freaking play again. They do not need to be in the
so you're talking
play
about
at all.
Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, and they are actually in the
Yes,
play a couple times.
they
Um,
do not need to be though.
so I've actually expanded their story greatly, and they also have an incomplete story arc in my stuff because they are pivotal in a few aspects of the Hamlet story.
I'm pretty sure that they're first in the but it has been a long time since I've watched or read Hamlet. Um, so
Yeah,
yeah,
no, I'm right. It's the
yeah,
Act 1, Scene 1 is takes place on the battlements of Eisenhower Castle, um, and it is between the three guards, Horatio, and the ghost,
right.
where Horatio goes out. I was thinking Hamlet was there for some reason, but I guess he wasn't.
Yeah,
But they ask, oh, that's right, he isn't there because they asked Horatio to go out there because they don't want to bother Hamlet because
yes,
Hamlet
because
is in mental distress.
yeah, and as far as I know, Hamlet has just come with these guys from England. I don't know. Anyway, long bullshit stories.
Well, they've just had the funeral of King Hamlet and the wedding of his brother
Yeah,
to his mother. Well, King
yes,
Hamlet's brother to
yeah,
Hamlet's mother. That's the only thing I really hate about writing this is because you have King Hamlet and Prince Hamlet and King Fornabras and Prince Fornabras. It's like, but I'm making it work. But yeah, so you do need, like, we get with Hamlet, we get why he is
mm,
so emotionally distraught. Like, not only did you lose your father, you find out that your father was murdered by his brother. You find out that your uncle murdered your father solely for power and greed and envy because he wanted his brother's wife. And now he is married to his brother's wife and, taking carnal pleasure with his brother's wife. Like, that's a very emotional, like, you get it. Like, Hamlet's like, yeah, no, you need to kill that SOB. Like,
Mm,
that's bad. So he's very relatable, and his paranoia and his kind of descent into madness and all his fatal flaws that he has, they're very natural. They're
mm,
very believable. They fit with his personality. It's a wonderful character arc to watch him go. It's one of the reasons why I'm not writing the novel in Hamlet's perspective, because I
yeah,
don't want you, if I was to put, because I am doing it as a prose, it's not as a play. I'm not writing as a
yeah,
play. I'm not even keeping really any of Shakespeare's words, except for a few iconic lines like, to be or not
mm,
to be, and a few things like that. But for the most part, I'm just writing it in my voice, in a modern day,
mm,
the way I write fantasy is how I'm writing this. So it's got that fantasy feel, but I'm not writing it in using that 400-year-old English language that is really difficult to read. But that's the thing, and that's what is so brilliant about that play, and the reason why it's lasted for as long as it has. We get that really strong protagonist that has both strengths and weaknesses. We actually sympathize with them, we relate to them, and we we don't want to see them make the choices that they're making, but they feel
mm.
natural. They feel like, you know like when he kills what's his name behind the curtain, when he stabs what's his name who is hiding, Ophelia's father. Can't
Yeah.
think of his name, but anyway, he's obviously just as shocked as we are when he murders that dude, but he's
Yeah.
now in it. So he just uses that to make, well, he either uses that to make everyone continue to think he's going more and more insane, or he actually is more and more insane and he's going down that path. We don't really know, but it still feels like it wasn't something. It doesn't feel forced. It doesn't feel contrived. It feels like
Yeah.
the next domino has just fallen. Like, how are you going to come back from this? You just murdered somebody. Oh, right, you're the prince, and you're exempt from law.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that's vitally important. The character, still, you have to have a compelling
So
protagonist.
I just want to highlight a few more modern takes as well to bring this home.
Mm-hmm.
Um, if you think of the first book of A Song of Ice and Fire, if you think of A Game of Thrones, from the perspective of Ned, it's a tragedy. Yeah? It is a tragedy where Ned's like, and I think that is part of the purpose of that book is to be a tragedy because Martin has a thing about showing the system of feudalism is a broken system. And Ned is the only noble amongst that bunch who is in
Mm-hmm.
any way something we would connect to as some kind of honorable, right? Enough within his context that we connect to him. We
Yeah.
want to see him come good. And then he makes choice. I mean, he could have, when he resigned his hand, he could have left. He could have left before, he could have left, he could have gone back to Winterfell and just been safe,
Yep.
you know? But he didn't because he kept digging and he basically just set up his own tragic downfall.
Yeah.
And it even has the foreshadowing in it because the first chapter opens with Ned executing a man, and the book closes with Ned being executed. So I think that if you look at the book from that tragic downfall perspective, it is very much there. And Ned is very much active in choosing the course that inevitably results in his tragedy. Abercrombie is another good example. I know you talk about the how the thing, how the story ends with everybody like losing everything. And I think, like having reread the series, I think that's the point. I think the point is that no matter who wins, no matter who wins no matter who dies, no matter who wins this fight, no matter any of that, their system their societal systems are broken
Yeah.
and inevitably result in everybody's downfall.
Yeah.
Um,
And these
so
aren't these aren't more modern, but just to expand upon that
Yeah.
list, The Great Gatsby is about the failure of society. Frankenstein's about the
Mm.
consequences of pride. Macbeth is about the cost of ambition. So, these are all things that, again, give you that meaningful kind of thematic.
Romeo and Juliet is a warning to not fall in love with your eyes and think after 3 days you should marry a guy. Just saying.
That's another one I want to rewrite. There's three Shakespeare plays that I want to rewrite as prose: Hamlet, Romeo and Juliet, and A Midsummer's Night's Dream.
So I don't know that I would rewrite Romeo and Juliet, but that's simply because Romeo and Juliet has got such a good movie adaptation in the 90s one with
Which
Leonardo
one?
DiCaprio,
Yeah, Romeo
where
plus Juliet.
yeah, where they've got the guns. Man, that's such a good adaptation. I love
Yeah,
that adaptation.
yeah,
Because they kept all of the Shakespeare words, but it's like, give me my long sword hoe, and it's this double-barreled rifle.
yep, yeah. No, that's a
Yeah,
good one. That's probably my favorite of the Romeo and Juliet's as well.
yeah, mine
John
too.
Leguizamo is just amazing in that.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, that's a good one.
The dude who played Mercutio was so good. A curse on both your houses.
I'm pretty sure that was. It's been too long since I've seen it, but I'm thinking that's John Leguizamo.
It was a black guy.
Oh,
He was so good.
I'm trying to remember who Mercutio is. Mercutio, whatever. Anyway,
Yeah.
that's off the subject. But yeah, those are the three I want to do. Some of my fans have said, yeah, but why not Macbeth too? It just doesn't sing to me as much as those other three. And we'll see. I mean, my answer was, well, it depends. If I actually can make some money off of these first three, I may rewrite all of Shakespeare's stuff.
There's a lot of plot there.
There is a lot of story there to be told. But those three are the ones that resonate with me the most. And I really want to see, and again, I'm doing this very different, and it's going to, for
Mm,
some people, it's going to be like, oh my God, this is the most amazing thing. And
mm.
for other people, they're going to be like, you're a heretic, and we should come to your house, stone you to death, and then burn your corpse. Because again, I'm not holding anything sacred whatsoever other than the story itself. Like, even though
Yeah.
I'm expanding upon the Prince Fornabros and the Rosencrantz and Guildenstern and a few other
Mm,
aspects of it. Those elements are there. Like,
yeah.
I am filling in some blanks, but I'm only filling in blanks between the pieces that are already there. So it's
Yeah.
still very loyal to the story itself. And I want to do that the same thing with Romeo and Juliet and A Midsummer's Night's Dream, but I don't know.
But
Macbeth is a
yeah.
rough one.
Yeah. Um, yeah. So anyway, let's return to our writing of a tragedy.
Mm-hmm.
Um, we could spend a lot of time talking about Shakespeare. So
Yes. Well, let's. So the first thing I actually wanted to talk
uh,
about was kind of defining tragedy, and we did touch on a little bit, but let's. I've got some notes just to kind of tie all that up and maybe make it a little bit more
mm,
um, concise. So, one of my notes that I wrote was, a tragedy has to be more than just sadness.
mm,
There's no. It's not about the bad things happening randomly or anything like that. Like the downfall, and we said this earlier, but it needs to feel inevitable yet preventable.
yeah.
And I think that preventable is the key thing, that at any time the reader feels like, yeah, but we could, I love what you said about writing two versions of it, one where it
Mm,
actually does work out and becomes that, classic hero's journey tale,
mm,
and then just subverting that, just going
yeah.
the different way. Because if you do that, again, I feel like it's going to have that preventable feel. Like,
Mm,
yeah, but it didn't have to turn out like this.
yeah.
And so I think that's one of those things, you know, that it needs, which is why, I wrote down words like, a fatal flaw or unavoidable fate. They need to, the tragedy needs to revolve around a character's weaknesses, their mistakes, their external circumstances leading to their downfall, which is what Hamlet, that is literally what leads to Hamlet's downfall. And I think those are the things. And the reason why I'm stressing these and the reason why I think about these so much is, one of my Drakeisms, the only thing that's real is the reader. The story's not real. The characters aren't real. The only thing that's real is the reader. And the reader has to have something to connect to. The reader has to have something that they're going to want to be affected by this moment that they're reading. And so if it's just about sadness, if it's just about, yeah, but fate is a fickle fiend, and you really have no control over anything. Now, it doesn't mean you can't write a story like that if that's the plot. There's some really good stories about you don't have it, but those aren't really about the tragedy of the event, like you said, like the child dying. It's a bigger, more esoteric concept than this one person's little role. It needs to have a pretty deep emotional experience. Readers should feel a mix of frustration, sorrow, inevitability, not just despair. Like if you just give them the despair, I don't think
they need to have a hope.
Yeah.
Like we
Yes.
had with Ned's death. Why did Ned's death hit so hard? Because right up until the last second, we were sure he was going to be sent to the wall. That was the whole story pointed us that they were like, he's going to be sent to the wall. Cersei had worked out this deal. Ned had accepted it. He'd confessed. Like this was going to be done. And then Joffrey said, no, I'm going to cut off his head. And I'm the king, and I've just done it in public, so now we're here.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think without that, there just isn't enough to hold. And again, it doesn't mean that you won't find, I mean, Saw is one of those movies, in my opinion, that doesn't really have that level of hope. But there's an audience for it.
But Saw, and those kinds of horror movies. The other one, there's another. But anyway, those kinds of movies are about a different thing, right? That's not a horror. Is not the same as a tragedy, in my point of view. They have some of the same elements, but a horror is about putting the reader in a horrifying situation,
right,
where they're faced with the question of, would I cut off my own arm to escape?
Yeah.
And then they sit there staring at their arm, thinking about it.
Yep.
That is not one where you're connecting to the character and their journey. It's much more about the situation than it is about the character as such.
Right, exactly. And that's what I'm saying. It needs that depth if you're going to write a really good tragedy. I mean, it really comes down to, in my opinion, at the very end of it, the reader should have hope that things might turn out differently, but kind of sense or realize that it's not going to.
Yeah.
Like, you're going, like I said earlier.
You want to foreshadow the fate. You want to show the inevitability of it. But at the same time, you want the reader to be like, no, he's going to go to the wall. It'll be fine. He's going to go to the wall. It'll be fine. No, it won't.
Yeah.
And it's the same with Hamlet or with Macbeth or with any of them, really. Although Macbeth is hard because you don't root, or at least I didn't root as hard for Macbeth as I did for any of the others.
Right. And that's the reason why, with
that's
everything
why
else,
he is hard, because it is not that easy to get behind Macbeth as a character and go like, yeah.
And that's why when my fans are like, well, what about Macbeth? I'm like, yeah, what about Macbeth? Like I actually like Hamlet. I like both Romeo and Juliet. I like, the characters.
I quite like King Lear. Like, I've got a lot of sympathy for King Lear. He got manipulated by Iago to Hellengarn. But
but that's the reason why these three are the ones that I wanted. I've been plotting and planning all three of those for the last 15 years. That's one of the reasons why I can pull the trigger on Hamlet. I mean, I have a detailed plot outline with 38 chapters. So I know exactly what I want to do. I've thought about it. I know where every piece leads to every piece, and so on and so forth. So, and technically you can get the opening chapter right now at Starving Writer Studio if you're interested. It technically isn't an opening chapter. It's a prelude because I refuse to write a prologue.
Othello. It's Othello who's Iago. Sorry.
Yes. Yes.
King Lear is the other guy. I have sympathy for Othello as well. Othello and King Lear.
Yeah.
King Lear is actually, I have a lot of sympathy for, um, because he basically just descended into madness, due to grief, and he misjudged his daughter, and yeah,
Yeah. All right. I
yeah,
think we've gotten most of those notes there. It needs to have some type of, when we're talking about the end, for it to be gratifying, it needs to have some type of emotional payoff for the reader.
yes.
It should be
There needs to
something
be
other
some
than
sort of
just an
emotional
emotional gut punch.
catharsis for the reader.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know, when you do that, it's going to stick with the reader long after they finish the story. If you don't do that, if it's just Saw or whatever, it's not going to have that
It's not going to be a
stick to
tragic
it.
payoff. And what you want in that payoff is you want the tragic flaw of the protagonist to really like play into that, like, we are here because Ned was stuck on his honor and
Yes.
unwilling to just compromise and walk away.
Yeah. Well,
We are,
let's
yeah,
talk about that a little bit more organized. So I think we should end this episode with, like, I've got a list of things that I feel are common pitfalls that you really need to try to avoid. But number two is a random or undeveloped tragic ending. And
yeah,
so a lot of people might think that Ned Stark falls into that. The pitfall is a character dies, but it doesn't feel earned. It doesn't feel connected. It doesn't do anything. And I can see there's an argument to be made for the Ned Stark death of that. And so my solution to that is to make sure it ties back into the protagonist's fatal flaw or the theme of the story that you're doing. And I do believe it does tie back to Ned Stark's fatal flaw, like you said. He has
mm,
such a strong sense of honor that he 100% is willing to get his head chopped off, as
mm.
opposed to taking the easier road and just going home and being
And
a
by the and sorry, just by the time he does make that decision, this is what really makes it tragic, right? By the time he does make that decision and he does compromise his honor, it's actually too late,
yes,
you know. So
yeah,
he tragically he actually loses both because he didn't make that decision earlier.
right, yeah.
Yeah. Anyway,
So
sorry.
so make sure you don't just have some random ending or an undeveloped ending or whatever. Don't, again, while it does absolutely happen in the real world, you know, people's story ends when they get excited, they get ready, they get this new promotion, they've got this new thing going on, a new child coming, and then on the way to the grocery store, they get hit by a bus and they die. Like, it happens and it sucks. But again, I feel like I'm a big proponent of the philosophy that readers come to fiction stories for fantasy fulfillment. And nobody fantasy fulfills by watching this person that has something good happen to them and then just randomly dies out of nowhere for no reason whatsoever. That's, you're not going to fantasy fulfill during that moment.
Mm.
So that's something very, very important. And that kind of ties into my first one, which is tragedy without a purpose. You know, just grimdark for the sake of grimdark. So your Saws and stuff like that. I don't agree with those. You know, killing characters or making things hopeless just for the shock value of the reader. Like, I hated in The Walking Dead, Glenn's death. You know, he
Mm.
did it in episode 100 or in issue 100 of the comic book because traditionally that's the issue that you lose readers. You lose
Mm.
about 20 to 30% of all I don't know why it is, but you know, 20 to 30% of all comic book readers stop reading after issue 100. They just stop. And so he was like, well, I'll keep them because I'll take one of their favorite characters, and for absolutely no reason, I will bash his head in with a baseball bat. And you're like, yeah, but you could have done it other ways. So it still needs to be, the tragedy needs to say something. It needs to have a deeper meaning. It needs to have something that just doesn't feel hollow, is my
Yeah.
solution for fixing that. Here's one for you, that you've already kind of mentioned, so I'd like to expand upon it. Another pitfall that I have is making the protagonist passive.
Yeah. But this applies to a lot of stories. Unless you have a payoff coming for the passivity of the character, The only people who like a passive protagonist in any story are Twilight fans, and though there are a legion of them, you also need to write sparkly vampires for them. So,
Yeah.
sorry. Sorry to Twilight fans out there. That was maybe a little bit of an unfair dig, but man, that chick spent books doing nothing but stare
I
out the window.
mean, um, what's that book series that I didn't finish? I got to 50 pages from the end. It's the main character has leprosy. Thomas
Uh,
Covenant.
Thomas Covenant.
Yeah. I
Oh, I
got
bailed way earlier.
I was 50 pages from the end of the last book and I was like, I'm done. I'm just done. Because every single book in that was, okay, I can see where this might go, but it never actually went there. It was always just a book that had potential for a story. And then that just turned into another potential for a different angle and another potential and another potential. And it was just like, I can't, and I did. I was about 50 pages from the end, and I really convinced myself that if I finish this, I'm going to be so disappointed because it's not going to end still. There's not going to be a payoff, and I would rather just cut it off, rather cut that dead leg off and just go without the leg than to end up actually finding out that there is no ending to this.
Anyway,
But yeah,
um,
that's that. But here's the thing, that's bad to
mm,
do, like you're saying, in anything, in any of these stories. But I really think that when you do it in a tragedy,
in a tragedy, it's triply important that your character, your protagonist, has agency, that they are making decisions. Because if the world forces them, or if fate forces them, or if an authority figure forces them, then the tragedy isn't theirs.
well, yes, I agree with that, but that's actually not where I'm going with here. I'm talking about a character that just lets things happen to them.
Yeah,
Where they never you can have a thing where fate is, and I'm still trying to make choices to change that.
mm,
So I'm still an
yeah,
active protagonist, even though my choices either aren't really choices because I didn't have a
yeah,
choice to make this. Like Finding Nemo, you know, Nemo, your son is kidnapped. You don't have
yeah,
the choice to go, oh well, and go home. Like fate has now stepped in and you have to go save your
yeah.
child. Like you have to. And yes, there's a dark joke in there somewhere, but let's just go
I,
with
I, I have a terrible joke for you about that. But okay, so here's the thing, right? Do you know how what actually happens with clownfish when the breeding female dies?
you
Okay,
don't.
so this is what happens with clownfish in general. There's one adult male and one adult female. All other clownfish that you see in an immediate anemone, they're all juvenile males, all of them. Okay. When a, when the female clownfish dies, the adult male clownfish becomes a female. They literally like sex change, become
Yep.
a
There
female.
are several fish that can do that.
Yeah. Clownfish generally only do it once in their life. The dory fish actually can do it multiple times.
Mm.
They switch depending on which there's more needed of to breed. But anyway, so they switched they switched to a female, and then the oldest juvenile male becomes an adult male, or the biggest juvenile male becomes an adult male, and they're now the new breeding pair. So if it was accurate to what clownfish behavior actually was, what should have happened when Mama died?
I see where you're going with that. I definitely see where you're going with that.
Sorry.
That's all right.
I
Anyway,
couldn't help it.
no, but getting back to so if fate is pushing them down, I think that when we discuss this, you need to give them a feeling of choice. The reader needs
Yeah.
to feel like they have some type of agency. But what I was really referring to that I see sometimes is where the protagonist literally is just this rag doll that makes no
Yeah.
decisions. And the problem with that is when you do that, in my opinion, I feel like it makes the reader frustrated because they feel like nothing, Like, why am I reading this?
Yeah.
There's no, this character should be doing something. I can think of things to do. This character's doing nothing. And so instead of feeling the tragedy of what the character's going through, they actually start resenting the character. They start resenting the story. And that's not where you want them to go. So the character has to be active in some way. I mean, it's called a protagonist for a reason. They
Yeah.
need to be
They've got to be
proactive.
protagonisting.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
I also think that you really should try to foreshadow the tragedy a little bit,
Hmm.
like give
I don't
some
have that on my
hints.
list, but that's a good one.
Yeah.
It needs to not come out of nowhere.
Yeah. You want to lay some groundwork and do some foreshadowing and so on, because otherwise it feels to the reader like, where did this come from? You know?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. And that's something I've thought a lot about. So like I have my prelude, which is out now
mm,
that they can read, but chapter one is actually, it starts with Hamlet and Horatio and a few other people riding behind King Hamlet on a battlefield as they're going out to the middle of the battlefield to meet King Fortinbras and Prince Fortinbras and their little retinue as they come together. And through there, basically, that's where King Hamlet challenges him to a duel instead of having your armies fight. And then King Hamlet kills Fortinbras, which is what
mm,
happens in the play just before. It's all hinted at. But one of the things that I do in there is I wrote lines that when you read it, it sounds like something King Hamlet would say to his son. But
mm,
then what happens at the end, you realize, if you're paying attention, that King Hamlet knew that this is where he knew he was going to get in a single combat and then kill King Fortinbras. It was
yeah.
never going to turn out any other way, even though some of the things he says leading up to that you take as,
Mm,
oh, okay, he's being kind of esoteric and he's being kind of philosophical and all this stuff. And then you look back and you're like, no, he literally already had in his mind that he was going to push this outcome down this path and he was going to kill this other guy. He was going to kill
yeah.
this other king. He wasn't going to let this king leave the battlefield alive. And so that's the foreshadowing that I'm doing for the larger Hamlet play that I have after that, the larger Hamlet story that I have after that. So yeah, I don't have that on my list, but doing foreshadowing, I think, is very, very important. But it's also very important on almost everything.
Yeah. 100%. It's just with the tragedy, because it's such a, you are essentially aiming to make the reader cry. Like
Yeah,
you are putting them in a bad emotional state. And
yeah,
if you're going to do that, if you're not going to give them a hopeful story, you need to like, it takes work to pull it off.
yeah, yeah. Tragedies are hard. I mean, they're
Yeah.
way harder to write than feel good stories.
Yeah.
And then the only other thing, because it kind of leads into what you were saying there, so maybe you can expand upon this one. The only other thing that I have as far as pitfalls that I see some people doing is, and this comes from you anyway, which is having those moments where you let the reader breathe.
Yeah.
It can't
I
just be
think
tragedy, 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 tragedy. There needs to be
the
some moments.
the reader needs to have moments of hope, moments of seeing things go right and so on. And it's very important with the tragedy. If it's all just dark all the time, then by the time they get to the end, they're like, well, actually, I'm glad he's dead.
Yeah.
Puts him out of his
Or
suffering.
or the note that I wrote was, because you're right, I think that can happen. But another thing that could happen is they could just become numb to the tragedy. If everything is
Yeah.
bad, everything is bad, everything is bad, then they just like, okay, so what? Yeah, everything's bad. I don't care anymore. So they
Yeah.
just they just they just lose their compassion for it.
I think one other thing that really drives the tragedy home, and I don't know if you can always do this, but personally, I feel like one of the things that drives the tragedy home is that you inevitably see life moving on, maybe a little bit worse. You know, like the Seven Kingdoms without Ned was worse. The Hamlet's kingdom got conquered by his enemy. There's a sense of like, not only has their death been obviously tragic for them, but it's a tragedy within their world, which now continues on a path without them.
Right. Yeah. I'm making it a little bit more personal.
Mhm.
So like I said, I've written the prelude. The story's told by Horatio.
Yeah.
That's how I'm telling the whole story. You're in Horatio's head the entire
Yeah.
time. But the prelude is him, a much older Horatio, obviously, because the events in the prelude, the events have already happened. And he's kind of
Yeah.
setting up and setting the stage for what we're going to go through. And we're going to go back in time to that battlefield and be a part of that and come through. But that's exactly, I haven't written it, but that's my last chapter that I have plotted, is a prelude, whatever, where we go back to the older Horatio right after the scene where Hamlet has killed himself and everyone else, and Fornabras has shown up. And then I go back into the future time to that older Hamlet, and I'm going to write kind of the cap to that, the tragedy of what happened after. And it's just going to give you that moment. But from Horatio, it's still going to be a personal thing from Horatio, because I am actually writing it in first person, which is something I don't normally write in. And actually, the funny thing is, because this is completely off the subject, but since the other day we found out that you wrote in the horribly disgusting third person present tense, because it's the right thing to
prologue.
do. But it's the right thing to do. It's the right thing to do for that scene. I'm actually going to be writing this story in both first person and third person.
Okay.
But I'm writing all the third person scenes in omniscient. So so the first person scene is going to be, is obviously all Horatio telling the story from a first person perspective as it's happening. And I'm hoping that by writing the scenes that Horatio is not, because I want to do the whole Prince Fornabras thing.
Because it's basically Horatio telling the reader about these events.
Right. That's what I'm hoping it feels like. I'm hoping it feels like Horatio has become a third party narrator telling a third person story that he wasn't there for, but he does know all the details for.
Yeah.
So I'm hoping it works. And I think it will. As much as I've complained about mixing first and third, I actually think that this is the right choice for this story, because there are at least 12 to 15 chapters that I have to write that Horatio is not in.
Yeah.
But the story can't be told without those chapters.
So every voice, every type, there's place for everything in writing.
Yeah, that's why creative is the first word of creative writing. There is no absolutes.
Exactly. So I think, just to recap, for me, the most important parts of your tragedy is create a compelling protagonist, make sure that they have agency, give them a fatal flaw, that their tragic flaw, foreshadow their fate, give them an up arc and then the down arc. And make sure you deliver a powerful emotional climax, which is that tragic moment that completes their tale.
That forces the reader to walk away with something.
Yeah, that forces the reader to walk away with, that was the fatal flaw that forced them into this.
And force them to think about, that's what a good tragedy does, is it forces you to think about yourself more so than feel-good endings. Star Wars: A New Hope, the theme is, should you rely on technology to save you, or should you rely on faith to save you? But we blow up the Death Star because we use faith, and then we're happy. But when you have something, that is a tragedy, like, the Pied Piper or King Midas, these little small short story tragedies, you don't think about the village and the dead children and the magical flute or anything like that. You think about yourself. You don't think about, King Midas murdering his daughter. You think about yourself in that. I think that's the most powerful things about tragedies. And one of the reasons why they're so hard is because they are the one type of story that at the end of it, the reader's not thinking really about the story. They're thinking about how that tragedy has now impacted them, and they're forced to look at the world around them differently now after going through that tragedy, way more so than a feel-good ending. It's why they're so hard to pull off, and why they're so awesome when you can pull it off correctly. And maybe it also is one of the reasons why I'm just using Hamlet and not change anything in the plot, because I already know that works. So now all I gotta do is put it in my voice, which people tend to like. So And then I know I'm not
And
going
I
to mess
think
up the whole story.
and I think that that is a good note on which to end this episode. And
Yep.
we will see you soon for another one.
Bye. If you are ready to take your writing to the next level and work with a group of highly motivated, dedicated writers who are all working to not only improve their writing, but improve your writing, plus you get to work with me on a weekly basis, then I'll encourage you to check out writersroom.us. This is a website that I have created that I really wish I had 30 years ago. It's everything a writer needs to become a better writer. Not only do we do weekly critique sessions, both from other members as well as me, we have daily writing sessions, I do monthly classes, Q&As, we have activities, I do all sorts of learning exercises, such as I do a quarterly writing prompt contest, and just tons and tons and tons of things. So if you're ready to get serious about your writing and you want to actually finish that novel and have a chance of it being published, then I encourage you to head on over to the Writer's Room and join me there. And as a special promotion for listeners of Releasing Your Inner Dragon, I'll go one step more. If you would like to get 50% off for 3 months, reach out to me. There's a million ways you can do that. You can do it through starvingwriterstudio.com, drakeu.com, any of my social medias such as LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook, X, whatever. Reach out to me, say that you would like to check out the Writer's Room for 50% off, and I will send you a link that will allow you to do just that. So hopefully you're ready to start getting serious about writing, and I'll see you in the Writer's Room.
Thank you for tuning in. This is Marie Mullaney, your co-host on this literary adventure. Our goal is to provide you with valuable insights and discussions on writing. If you believe in our mission, please like and subscribe our podcast. Sharing our episodes with your community not only helps us grow, but also contributes to a richer, more diverse conversation about storytelling. We appreciate your support. For a deeper understanding of the topics we've discussed, head over to Just in Time Worlds on YouTube. It is a treasure trove where fantasy meets history and science. Every Tuesday, you'll find new videos that delve into the intricacies of world building, drawing from our rich real-world history. Whether you're a writer, a role player, or just a fantasy enthusiast, Just in Time Worlds offers unique insights that will enrich your perspective. Check it out and join the journey of crafting incredible worlds.